On September the 3rd, 1887, the morning wind in Coldwater, Wyoming Territory, came off the flats sharp enough to sting the eyes, though the sun was clear and bright above a sky the color of split steel. And by noon, the thermometer nailed outside Pike General Supply had climbed to 62 degrees, while 312 souls stood in small knots along the wagon track and watched a ruined man set stone where no prosperous man would build. The rise he had chosen lay northwest of town, a wind-cut shoulder of ground where sage grew thin and the topsoil gave way quickly to hardpan and glacial cobble. Land the speculators had passed over for 5 years because spring mud made wheels sink and winter frost bit down as deep as 18 inches before November was done. Bo Tucker worked there in shirt sleeves despite the wind, broad back now from labor that had replaced his old clerkly stiffness, and lifted each block from a handcart with a care that looked almost ceremonial, as if the shape and seam of every stone mattered as much as its weight. The children counted his hammer blows and lost track before 20. The adults did not bother to count. They only watched and traded judgments in low tones, because cold weather was still weeks away, and the thing he was building sat half below grade, like a grave open for a living man. 10 years earlier, Bo Tucker had walked office planks in polished boots and carried survey folios wrapped in oilcloth, chief survey clerk for a union spur project running east of Granite Falls toward the cattle routes, a post that required a steady hand, clean cuffs, and trust. He had all three until spring runoff tested a grading report signed under his authority and exposed figures that had been altered before filing by men with better connections than his own. The embankment failed in 3 places. 2 mule teams were lost in the washout, and the inquiry moved quickly toward the nearest name with no family protection. Bo was dismissed in 12 days, blacklisted in 2 territories, and left with a reputation that could not be fed to a horse or traded for flour. The men who arranged the bribe kept their desks. Bo kept the blame. He drifted north with timber crews in Montana Territory, taking winter contracts no one with options accepted, felling lodgepole in drifts that reached a man's waist, and hauling green logs over frozen cuts where one misstep could break a team trace and a leg in the same moment. Those camps held Finns who had crossed harder winters than any plains clerk could imagine, men who spoke little while working and less while eating, but who measured snow load with a glance and read wind crust by touch. Bo learned from them because he had no standing left to protect and no use for pride. He learned that earth was not merely dirt, but mass, and mass kept its own counsel against weather. He learned to channel heat through stone and packed soil instead of trying to fight the wind with thin boards and louder stoves. He learned to vent smoke in long runs so flame could be fed without flooding rooms with soot. He learned that buried walls, if drained and tamped correctly, held near 55 degrees, while surface temperatures swung from thaw to killing cold. In camp ledgers, those methods were written as practical notes beside axe inventories and ration tallies, never as miracles, never as theory, only as work that kept men alive until breakup. By June of 1887, he had reached Coldwater with a mule, a worn chest, 2 iron chisels, and $58 in paper and coin. The town sat young and brittle at the edge of promise, 9 years old, 1 church, 1 schoolroom, 1 livery, 1 boarding house, and 1 general store that served as market, message post, and informal court for every reputation within 20 miles. Harlan Pike seemed to rule that court without holding office. He was a large man in good wool and polished boots, with a trimmed beard and a gold watch chain that flashed whenever he pointed, and he had built prosperity by extending credit when harvests were fair and tightening terms when weather turned uncertain. By the ledger, he looked generous. By winter accounts, at least to Bo, he looked different. Pike greeted Bo by name before Bo reached his counter, and spoke of the failed grading report and dismissal in a tone that made the blame sit neatly on one shoulder. Bo could not tell how Pike had gathered it all, only that he handled the story like practiced stock. When Bo asked after lots near the creek, Pike steered him toward the rise with a smile that did not reach his eyes and said the parcel was available for a fraction because no one wished to freeze there. Bo paid $27 for 1¼ acres and took the deed without argument. The laugh that followed him to the door was quiet, but it carried. Work began the next morning. He staked a rectangle 32 feet by 24, aligned long east to west, so prevailing north wind struck the narrow wall, then cut the footprint down 4 feet below existing grade with spade, mattock, and a borrowed scraper, setting spoil in piles sorted by clay content. He dug a perimeter drain trench 18 inches deeper than the floor line and laid rounded creek stone over woven willow and coarse sand, so seepage would travel away from the foundation instead of freezing under it. He purchased rejected masonry by wagon from a kiln yard near Casper Road, cracked block and misfired brick at $11 per wagon, and hauled 3 loads over 12 days, paying $2 extra each trip because teamsters did not like the rise. He paid anyway. The stone was sound where it mattered. Coldwater watched the geometry of his labor become visible week by week. A half-sunken shell with walls 2 feet thick at the base, tapering to 18 inches above grade, chinked with clay-lime mortar mixed at 1 part lime to 3 parts screened earth. He set cedar sill beams hewn from salvage timbers and treated them with pine tar and salt brine, then laid joists higher than expected, leaving room beneath for air movement no one understood yet. At dusk, he covered open work with canvas weighted by rock, because 1 hard rain could undo a week of tamping. At dawn, he pulled the canvas back and resumed. Harlan Pike rode out on the 5th day of stone setting with 2 ranchers and addressed Bo loud enough for every hand within earshot. He said the place looked like a burial vault and named it Tucker's Tomb, then repeated the name in town that evening until it spread through the church steeps and the schoolyard and the line outside his store. Bo heard men use it with laughter when he passed. He heard women use it with pity. Boys scratched tomb in the dust by Bo's cart ruts and ran before he reached them. Bo answered none of it until Nels Harrow, a blacksmith with kinder habits than most, asked whether the talk bothered him. Bo lifted 1 more block into place, checked its seat with the handle of his hammer, and said, "Let them talk. Words do not hold heat." By the 2nd week of September, the walls stood to chest height on the windward side and shoulder height on the lee, and Bo turned to the part of the work that looked least sensible to outsiders and most essential to him. He marked an exterior alcove on the south wall, 6 feet deep and 5 feet wide, where a firebox could be fed from outside without opening interior doors to winter air. He ordered flue tile sections in mixed lengths from a freight lot. Paying 9 cents per foot for pieces, others had refused for hairline glaze flaws that did not affect draft. He set them first on dry runs over trestles to test fall and alignment, adjusting by fractions so heat would travel under flooring before rising to the stack. The children called the tiles pipes for moles. Bo called them channels and kept laying them. He was not building comfort in the ordinary sense. He was building margin. In account, pages kept folded in his coat. He listed expected burn rates by cord and day, grain reserves by pound and soul, lamp oil by ounce and hour of darkness, and floor temperature estimates based on exterior swings he had measured in Montana camps. He marked failures in red pencil, damp clay pockets near the north drain, 1 collapsed trench wall after a night storm, 2 loads of warped plank unfit for joists. He rebuilt each weak point with no witness except the wind and the mule tied to a scrub pine. On Sundays, when church bells called, Bo worked through the service and heard hymns carried thin across the rise. By Monday, he heard that Pike had pointed to his absence as proof of arrogance. Yet, even those who disapproved still paused at the edge of the site and watched the discipline of the construction. Courses stayed level within a finger width across 24 feet. Joint lines remained tight. Berms were tamped in lifts, not dumped loose, and compacted with a hand rammer until footprints barely marked. This was not frantic digging by a disgraced clerk. It was trained practice, executed patiently. Before September closed, the half-sunken house had taken on a severe, deliberate form, not handsome by town standards, but substantial in the way root cellars and bridge piers are substantial, each decision tied to weight, airflow, drainage, and fuel. In town and along the wagon track, Bo kept hearing the jokes, the nickname, the predictions of winter failure. He kept building what weather would recognize first. Weather would recognize it soon enough, and the first sign came not as snow but as warmth that did not belong there. On October 11th, a wind out of the southwest settled over Coldwater like breath from a furnace door, and by late afternoon the same thermometer outside Pike General Supply read 71 degrees, 20 above the weekly average, while old mud in the wagon ruts loosened and ran in thin brown threads toward the ditch. Men stood without coats and called it a gift. Teamsters watered horses in shirt sleeves and smiled at a sky too clean for the season. Yet before sunrise on the 14th, that warmth broke as if a latch had been lifted somewhere beyond the plains, and by dawn the temperature had fallen to 12 degrees, with needle frost on every board face in town. Window glass filmed white from the inside. Pump handles burned bare fingers. Smoke dropped low and flat instead of rising. The shift was so abrupt that even children stopped talking as they walked. Bo Tucker rose before light and crossed the rise with a lantern shielded in his coat, checking what his own body already knew from the bite at his teeth and the way breath clung near the ground. He walked to the willow cut near the creek and found geese lifting in long, disciplined lines, heading south 2 weeks earlier than any autumn ledger in Coldwater recorded. He circled the beaver pond north of the old ferry trace and measured dam height against a stake he had driven in September. The animals had packed mud and branch nearly 10 inches higher in 6 days. By noon, he watched the livery horses from the lee wall of his site and saw their breath hang low in heavy clouds that did not shear away in wind, a sign he had learned in Montana camps where men listened to such details if they wished to see spring again. He did not call it omen. He called it evidence. That afternoon, he rode into town with a short list folded in his glove: salt pork, hard wheat, lamp oil, and coarse salt, in quantities that looked excessive to anyone planning for ordinary weather. Pike stood behind his counter in a dark vest, collar stiff, expression composed in the manner of a banker receiving poor collateral. Bo asked for 40 pounds of pork, 60 pounds of wheat, 8 gallons of oil, and 5 sacks of salt, offering cash first and then asking whether credit could cover the remaining balance until December freight arrived. Pike opened his ledger, turned 2 pages with care, and shut it again. "I do not carry risk for projects buried in dirt," Pike said, loud enough for the line at the barrel scales to hear. "You lost 1 line already, Tucker. I do not intend to lose mine beside your mole burrow." Bo placed what money he had on the counter and said, "Then, sell me what this buys." Pike weighed out less than half the request. The prices had climbed since September. By dusk, after word spread that a hard turn had come, he raised them again for everyone in town, and by the next morning flour cost nearly double its autumn rate, while kerosene rose by the quart before noon. Bo did not argue in public and did not ask a second favor. He carried his smaller load back to the rise, marked the deficiency in red pencil on his account page, and began to redesign the house around scarcity rather than convenience. He set the pencil down, closed the ledger against the wind, and returned to work before dusk could harden the ground. By the third week of October, Bo shifted from foundation labor to hidden systems with a precision that looked obsessive to neighbors and entirely ordinary to anyone who had wintered in deep country. He reopened the floor trench, cut a crawl space 4 feet below joist line, and shored the walls with plank scraps set upright every 2 feet to prevent sloughing until permanent facing could be laid. He measured 2 parallel underfloor runs, each 26 feet long and 18 inches high, keeping a 1/4-inch fall every 6 feet toward the draw chimney so draft would pull steadily even in crosswind. The flue tiles he had purchased cheap for glaze flaws were bedded in clay sand mortar, joints wrapped in lime-soaked canvas strips before backfill, then sealed again with packed earth tamped in 6-inch lifts. He wasted nothing. Broken sections became baffles. Cracked corners became clean-out ports capped with hinged iron plates, bought second-hand for 14 cents each from a rail salvage lot. The exterior fire alcove on the south wall took shape in stone and stubbornness. He built the firebox throat narrow to increase pull, set a cast-iron grate he had traded for labor at Nels Harrow's forge, and lined the chamber with refractory bricks scavenged from a collapsed kiln stack east of town. The opening faced away from prevailing north wind and could be fed without opening the main door, a detail Pike's customers mocked as overthinking until the first night that sleet drove sideways and no one else could keep coals alive without filling rooms with smoke. Bo installed a damper plate in the chimney run with a hand lever reachable from indoors through a sealed slot, then tested the draw with damp straw and pine shavings, recording smoke behavior at 3 vent positions. 2 open and heat fled. 2 tight and gases backed. He marked the workable range with filed notches and scratched numerals. He also began the room that few observed because it sat under their notice as plainly as it sat under his floor. Beneath the rear corner, he cut a root vault 11 feet by 9, headroom just over 6 feet at center, walls lime-washed twice to resist mold, cedar shelves fastened in tiers with 1-inch air gaps between boards for circulation. He set jar spacing at 3 fingers so frost on one vessel could not bridge to the next. He hung cured meat from cross poles at fixed intervals and kept the floor packed but not sealed, allowing controlled moisture to moderate dryness in stored grain. He wrote ratios in his ledger as if entering survey figures: 1 pound beans per soul per week, 3 pounds wheat flour if labor remained heavy, lamp oil at 1 ounce per hour per room if wick trim stayed disciplined. By the last week of October, he had 340 jars in inventory, 40 sacks of mixed grain, and less pork than he wanted by nearly half. Mockery and cold water hardened with the weather. Pike did not need to shout now. His standing did the work. At church committee meeting, he objected to Bo's name on the wood allotment list, saying a man who buried fire should not advise others on safety. At the school levy discussion, he called Bo unstable in judgment, and 2 ranchers repeated the phrase until it held the weight of consensus. Younger men from families that bought heavily on Pike's credit rode past the rise after dark and stamped fresh-packed berms flat with boot heels and horse hooves, laughing while they worked. Bo found the damage at dawn, set his jaw, and rebuilt before breakfast, rammer rising and falling in a rhythm the wind could not interrupt. Nels Harrow offered to stand watch one night with a shotgun. Bo refused and asked instead for scrap nails and 2 lengths of chain. The one soul who crossed from spectators to witness was 14-year-old Nessa Vale from the livery, slight as a willow switch with cracked knuckles from currycomb work and a practical silence beyond her years. She began by leaving things where she knew Bo would find them: bent nails straightened against an anvil edge, coal scuttle ash dry enough for traction mix, a chipped lantern globe that still held flame if turned right. Bo thanked her once and set a small task the next morning, asking her to hold a plumb line while he checked vent alignment. She held it steady in wind that made older hands fidget. On November 2nd, with dawn temperature at 19 degrees, Bo invited Nessa to step barefoot onto a test plank laid over the active Flu run after 2 hours of controlled firing. She looked at him uncertainly, then did as asked, and the surprise in her face was plain even before she spoke. "It is warm," she said. "Not near warm. Warm." "Remember where you stood," Bo answered. "Remember how long the fire burned and how long the board stayed so." She began returning before first light twice each week, learning to read damper position, ash color, and draft tone at the chimney lip. He taught without ceremony and without claiming authority, the same way it had been given to him in timber camps where instruction passed through work, or not at all. He showed her how to bank coals for 6-hour release, how to clear soot traps without cracking tile, how to keep a clean-out bucket outside until ash cooled fully. He spoke less of danger than of sequence, because sequence prevented danger. 3 days passed before Pike saw Nessa carrying kindling to the rise and called her over in front of the store porch crowd. He told her she was helping a disgraced man build a hazard that would poison sleeping families. Nessa listened, then said she had seen the vents and the outside feed, and that smoke did not enter living rooms when the system was run correctly. Pike told her she was a child, repeating nonsense. She returned to the livery without answering further, and that evening left 2 more sacks of ash by Bo's door. By mid-November, the house no longer looked like a grave to anyone honest enough to observe it closely. Burmid earth rose smooth against the lower walls, shed water away from the foundation, and broke wind at the base. The roof pitch sat low and deliberate to reduce lift, sheathed in plank, overlaid with tar paper, then weighted by split stone at measured intervals, tied to interior anchors, so gusts could not peel it back in one hard night. Windows were smaller than town fashion, deep set with interior shutters and wool felt seals. The main room floor carried 3 discrete grates whose iron mouths opened to underfloor channels now fully cured and draft tested. When evening cold tightened, a faint, steady warmth rose from those grates and moved outward across boards with the patience of tidewater. The same week, Bo walked chain measure from his door toward the church road and set thin marking stakes at intervals in frozen ground, noting distances in his book and saying little when asked what line he was laying out. Nessa watched this in silence, then asked whether the marked route should run toward the livery and Pike's store as well. Bo studied the sky a long while before answering. "Yes," he said, "all 3. We build routes before weather decides whether we deserve time." By the first day of December, a brittle light lay over Coldwater, and the wind had gone so still that smoke stood upright like dark poles above each chimney. That morning, a rider came from east of Granite Falls with ice in his beard, and word that drifts had swallowed the rail spur in 2 cuts, and telegraph poles had snapped in sequence along the line. Flour deliveries were delayed without estimate. Kerosene wagons had turned back. In Pike's store, buyers gathered shoulder to shoulder and watched full shelves begin to thin by the hour, while Bo Tucker, hat brim crusted white, purchased rope, canvas, and iron stovepipe, then carried them out to the rise without a word. Before dusk, he and Nessa pulled the marker stakes and sank cedar anchor posts in their place, 3 feet deep, tamped with gravel and clay, iron eyes fixed at shoulder height for lines that would not disappear when the road did. Before dusk failed, Bo and Nessa ran the first hemp line from the cedar eye at his door to the nearest post on the church road, keeping it chest high so a grown soul could grip it with mittens and still feel each knot marker through wool. He spaced knots every 6 feet, then tied doubled loops at each post for hands gone numb, and at the church corner he spliced a second run toward the livery, while Bo measured tension by leaning his full weight backward until the rope gave only an inch. Canvas sleeves cut from wagon covers and stitched with sail needle went over each exposed splice to keep sleet from freezing the braid into brittle ridges. When the first line held, they set a second line lower, at waist height, for shorter walkers and for dragging a travois if legs failed. Nels Harrow arrived after forge close with a bucket of tar and an armful of iron hooks, and by lantern light the three of them sealed knots, marked posts with lime wash, and left no section untested. Inside the half-sunken house, Bo turned from roots to capacity. The main room had been planned for one man. It was now laid out for many. He moved his own cot against the north wall, built two-tier sleeping platforms from rough pine along the east side, and left a clear center lane 10 feet wide so souls could enter, shed ice-stiff coats, and move to grates without trampling the fire tools. He added 3 water barrels near the rear wall, each 40 gallons, bunged tight and raised on stones so cold, floor draft could not freeze the lower staves. At the south entry, he fixed peg rails at shoulder and knee height for drying mittens, socks, and wrapped feet, and beneath them he set shallow drip pans hammered from old stove sheeting to catch melt before it turned to interior ice. He shifted the root vault inventory by strict order, jars grouped by caloric value and cook time, quick broth near the hatch, slow beans and hard wheat deeper back, and each shelf edge marked in charcoal with ration totals for 10, 20, and 40 souls over 7 days. By candle, he and Nessa tested the underfloor system as if preparing an engine for military inspection. Firebox charge, 8 pounds split pine, 2 pounds coal, damper at second notch for 20 minutes, third notch for 12, then back to first while ash settled. Great temperatures were taken with touchsticks cut to equal length. If resin on the stick softened too fast, draft was too hot, and fuel was being wasted. Clean-out plates were opened in sequence, never together, and soot was sifted for ember before disposal in the exterior pit. He taught her to read the chimney plume against starlight, not for color alone but for pulse, because a pulsing plume meant unstable draw, and unstable draw meant trouble before dawn. She repeated every sequence aloud while he watched her hands, correcting only when a latch closed out of order. He gave her a written card on scrap ledger paper, 8 lines in block print, and told her to memorize it and burn it if ever the paper went wet. By the second week of December, the rope network reached all 3 public buildings that mattered in storm: church, livery, and schoolroom, with anchor posts every 30 yards, drift markers tied in red cloth at knee and shoulder height, and a canvas windbreak stretched along the first 20 feet outside Bo's own door to create a staging pocket where rescuers could breathe before stepping into full exposure. He built a hand sled from barrel staves and bed slats, fitted with rope traces and a wool-lined basin wide enough for 1 injured adult or 2 children under blankets, then stored it beside the fire alcove under oilskin. At Nels Harrow's forge, he traded 2 days of masonry repair for 6 forged eye bolts and a narrow iron grapnel that could be thrown from one line to another if a post failed. In his ledger, he entered every exchange with date, cost, and purpose, then posted a copy on his door in plain script so no one could claim hidden hoarding. Rope 92 cents, canvas $1.30, iron fittings $1.12, stovepipe lengths 64 cents, total $3.98, all paid. Coldwater read that posting and chose mockery over imitation. Pike began at his counter by tapping the paper with one ringed finger and telling customers that panic was a business model for men who could not prosper honestly. He said Bo had built a trade in fear and intended to profit when decent houses failed, then held up a coil of his own store rope and priced it at 3 times autumn rate, while promising that ordinary prudence, not buried contraptions, had carried frontier towns for generations. Ranch wives waiting for lamp oil repeated his language on the porch and said Bo's lines looked like a gallows yard spread over the rise. Young men from the South pasture crews walked the church route after dark and cut 2 marker flags, then drove a wagon wheel against one cedar post until it leaned enough to slacken the rope. At dawn, Bo reset the post, tamped fresh gravel, retied the line, and replaced the flags with tin strips that would rattle in wind and could not be torn by hand as easily as cloth. The exclusion turned institutional before Christmas. At a town committee gathering in the schoolroom, Pike proposed a safety order forbidding private rope lines that crossed common paths without council approval, claiming they would trip horses and injure children in clear weather. Reverend Abel Crow, tired and pale from visiting sick cabins, asked whether the order might be delayed until freight resumed, but Pike pressed the vote while half the benches nodded. Nels Harrow spoke against the measure and said he had tested each line himself and that no horse had stumbled where knots were properly marked. The order failed by 1 vote, not from changed hearts but from uncertainty over legal authority in a settlement not yet incorporated. Pike called the result temporary and warned that liability would fall on Bo if any harm came. Bo stood in the rear through all of it, hat in hand, and said only that he would mark every crossing twice and post lanterns when weather turned. Cruelty settled into routine after that. Boys shouted Tucker's tomb when he hauled fuel. 2 ranch hands dumped butcher sweepings at his gate one night, forcing him to clear frozen offal before dawn so the approach stayed passable. Women who had once traded preserves for his stonework now crossed to the far side of the street when he entered Pike's store, unwilling to be seen near him while credit lines tightened. He did not answer insult with speech. He answered it by opening his yard each Sunday after church for 1 hour of practical instruction. No charge, no lecture, only demonstration. Most weeks, 3 souls came, then 4, then none, then 7 when a hard freeze split 2 cistern pipes in town. He showed whoever arrived how to bank a foundation with packed earth, how to seal a draft without trapping smoke, how to stack fuel off ground moisture, how to hang cured meat where frost could not bridge from wall to fat. He neither invited Pike nor barred him. 3 days before Christmas, warning signs multiplied, and Bo named them plainly to anyone willing to listen. Frost feathers formed on interior nails by noon in houses that still held morning fire, indicating humidity collapse and heat loss through every seam. The creek below the ferry trace skimmed over at dawn, then lifted and buckled by afternoon from anchor ice rising beneath, a pattern Finn Cruz had taught him to fear because it meant sustained deep cold upstream. Cattle on the North Flats turned their hindquarters to a wind that had not yet arrived, bunching tight against fence corners at sunset. Ravens that usually fed the slaughter pit stayed inland and flew low, wing beats heavy as if avoiding open air above the river. On clear nights, a hard white ring formed around the moon, doubled on the western edge, and by morning the ring became fine ice haze that made distant lights blur like wet ink. Bo walked door to door with a short message. Bring wood inside now. Fill every vessel with water before lines freeze. Store food where wind cannot strip heat from it, and tie routes between buildings before drifts erase roads. Many heard him. Few acted. Pike told those gathered near his stove that weather signs had frightened settlers in every decade, and that commerce, not alarm, kept towns alive. He sold out of coffee and sugar by New Year at prices few could afford, then locked kerosene in the back room and released it by pint to favored accounts. At the church social on January 2nd, several families laughed that Bo was measuring moon halos, while ordinary folk prepared by prayer and common sense. Reverend Crow did not laugh, but he did not challenge them either. His coal allotment was low, and he had 72 congregants depending on his calm. Nessa carried Bo's warnings to the livery stalls and filled extra buckets without being asked, then returned to the rise and learned to tie blind knots with mittens on. because Bo said hands would not always be bare when a line snapped. On January 6, 1888, a false quiet came over Coldwater so complete that wagon axles could be heard a half-mile away and chimney smoke climbed straight for an hour before flattening all at once toward the southeast. Bo and Nessa stood by the church post at first light and tested each rope in sequence, then checked lantern caches sealed in tin pails at 3 waypoints, each pail holding matches dipped in wax, spare wick, and a folded strip of salt pork wrapped in cloth. He added one more measure that morning, stretching a final guideline from the livery side door to Pike's rear loading bay, though no request had come from the merchant and no welcome was expected. When Nessa asked whether that line would be cut if Pike found it first, Bo said that a line served whoever could reach it, and the weather would not ask who had mocked whom before it took hold. By nightfall, the temperature had fallen from 24 to 3 degrees, and the boards of ordinary houses began to crack in sharp reports that carried across the flats like distant rifle shots. Bo banked the firebox, set the damper at first notch, laid out blankets by count, and hung a slate near the door with chalked instructions for entry order, grate rotation, and water ration if arrivals exceeded 60 souls. Then he checked the knots one last time, from his threshold to the church and out toward the livery, his lantern beam striking each post and returning as a pale blink in the deepening dark. Coldwater barred its doors. Bo left his unlatched. Coldwater barred its doors. Bo left his unlatched. Through the first hours of January 7th, the wind came in probing gusts from the northwest, not yet a full assault, but hard enough to drive powder snow through keyholes and under thresholds, and by dawn the thermometer at the church porch read 11 below zero, while stove smoke that escaped the chimneys was ripped flat across the roofs like dark cloth. Bo rose every 90 minutes to feed the exterior firebox in measured charges, keeping the damper between first and second notch, then walked each interior grate with the back of his hand and a pine touchstick, confirming the floor held steady warmth from wall to wall. At first light he pulled on wool, clipped his safety line to the door eye, and checked the nearest anchor posts. The ropes had iced, but they held. By January 9th, the pattern had sharpened into a discipline of cold. Morning temperatures did not climb above 2 degrees. Water buckets crusted at the rim even when kept by stoves. Pike General Supply opened late and closed early to conserve fuel, and the line outside formed before sunrise, souls stamping feet in silence, while Pike's clerks measured flour by tighter scoops and sold kerosene by half pint. The broad confidence he had worn all autumn remained in his posture, yet the store itself had begun to betray him. Shelves that once looked abundant now showed plank between sacks. Bean barrels stood open and nearly scraped clean. A chalk slate near the till listed 3 prices for the same goods, each higher than the week before. Bo passed the queue only once that day, purchased 2 spools of thread and a sack of coarse meal, and returned to the rise without speaking. 3 days later, the cold tightened again, and structures built for ordinary winters began to surrender in small, cumulative failures that no prayer meeting could vote away. On January the 12th, 2 stovepipes on Willow Lane split at their seams from thermal stress, filling rooms with smoke until windows were opened and precious heat bled into the dark. At the schoolroom, a frozen hinge snapped off the south door, and the teacher had to lash the panel shut with harness leather. Near the livery, one of the Keene barn rafters sagged under drift load and stayed there, bowed like a tired back. No one called it collapse. Everyone noticed. By the second week of January, Bo had moved beyond preparation into operations. He stacked split pine in rows by burn order, marked in chalk by expected heat output, and kept a running tally on the slate by his door. Dry wood, 1 3/4 cords. Coal, 212 pounds. lamp oil 6 gallons and 10 ounces, potable water 118 gallons. Nessa Vale crossed to him twice each day along the rope line, face wrapped to the eyes, to report which households still had fuel and which had shifted to burning furniture scraps. He sent her back each time with practical instructions rather than warnings. Move beds away from exterior walls, seal lower door cracks first, keep one room occupied and close the rest, never sleep with a fully shut flue. On January 15th, a deceptive calm settled over the basin. The wind fell to almost nothing. The noon reading rose to 28 degrees, and for 6 hours Coldwater stepped outside and believed the worst had passed. Children were kept indoors, but men walked with coats open, and Pike stood on his porch telling buyers that rail service would resume within days, and that prudent reserves, not alarm, had carried his business through harder seasons. Bo watched from the rise as frost fog formed over the creek in a low white band, then refused to lift though the air had warmed. He added 2 more lantern caches to the rope network before dusk and doubled the knot markers on the church run. Nels Harrow saw him at work and asked whether he expected another blow. Bo answered, "Not another blow. The long one." The long one arrived on January 19th, 1888, just after noon. A gray wall advanced out of the north, flattening horizon and sky into one moving mass, and within 40 minutes the wind was sustained above 50 miles per hour, with gusts strong enough to shake window frames in their casings. Snow did not fall in flakes now. It traveled sideways in hard streams that stung exposed skin raw in seconds and packed against doors as if shoveled there by invisible crews. Bo lit the staging lantern at his entry pocket, clipped himself to the main line, and made the first route check toward the church. He returned bent low, coat white with rime, reporting to no one but his own ledger. Visibility 6 feet, then 4, then less than 2. Night made the storm absolute. By midnight, the outside temperature had fallen to 36 below. At 2 in the morning, it reached 41 below, and the wind turned every gap in every board wall into a blade. The weather wasn't weather anymore. It was pressure and force, working each seam until it found entry. Houses with proud porches lost railings first, then shingles, then sections of roofskin that tore and vanished into the dark. Barn doors banged loose and froze open. Livestock pressed against one another and against walls, steaming in panic. At Pike's store, clerks fought drifts all night from the loading bay, shoveling, bracing, and shoveling again, while Pike counted lamp stock by lantern light and watched frost grow inward across his own front glass. On January 20th, Elias Finch died 10 yards from his woodpile. He was 61, a widower with a careful habit of tying kindling bundles in twine lengths cut to equal measure, and he had told neighbors all autumn that he had seen harder storms in Nebraska and would see this one through by routine. Near dawn, with his fire dropping and his shed drifted shut on one side, he looped a rope around his waist and stepped from his back door toward stacked wood he could see but could not reach quickly enough through the waist-deep drift. When they found him after daylight, the twine-wrapped bundle was still under his arm, and the rope had gone taut between 2 fence posts no one could cross in that wind. His stove had burned out an hour earlier. The room behind him was orderly, bed made, kettle waiting. By January the 21st, the 3rd day of sustained blow, Pike's prosperity failed in public. The roof over the rear half of Pike General Supply had taken drifting from 2 directions since the first afternoon, one bank climbing from the alley, another from the street side where shoveling had ceased when 2 hired men lost feeling in their hands. At dawn, a crack sounded through the storm, followed by a muffled drop as joists gave way, and the rear span folded inward. Sacks, shelving, and lamp crates disappeared into a slope of snow and broken timber. Pike stood in the front section, coat thrown over nightclothes, and stared at the tilt where his storeroom had been. The gold watch chain was still at his vest, but his boots were unlaced and his beard carried ice. No one came to buy. There was almost nothing left to sell. On January the 23rd, Marta Keene did not survive the drift that sealed the East Lane. Her family cabin had taken snow through a loose eave seam all night, and at first light she tried to clear a breathing channel from the side door to the stove vent, while her husband held the inner panel and called directions he could not see through the white. The drift broke over her shoulder and pinned her against the outer wall before the line they had tied from hinge to post could be hauled tight. Neighbors reached her when the wind eased for less than a minute, but by then the cold had already done its quiet work. She was 32, known for stitching winter mittens from old wool coats and sending them to children whose parents could not pay. In her work basket by the stove lay one unfinished pair, thumb gussets cut and waiting. That evening, Reverend Abel Crow made his decision at the church. Coal was nearly gone, and 20 souls had crowded into the nave under quilts and horse blankets, with frost forming on the inside of the north wall. Crow had opposed panic all winter because calm was what his office required, but calm could not melt ice in lungs or keep infants warm on empty stoves. He sent 2 older boys home under escort before the wind rose again, then tied himself to the church post line and began crossing toward the livery to gather 2 more families reported trapped near the stable yard. Halfway to the creek bend, where the route dipped over plank hidden under drift, his right leg broke through snow crust and dropped into water running black beneath surface ice. Nels Harrow and another man hauled him out within moments, but the wind seized wet wool faster than hands could strip it. They reached the church doorway with him conscious and speaking, asking first whether the boys had made it home. He did not survive the night. By January the 24th, desperation had stripped Coldwater of pride more efficiently than argument ever could. Windows were shuttered not for privacy but because glass had become a liability. Families burned fence rails, table legs, and account books. At the livery, horses were moved into one shared stall block to preserve heat, and Nessa Vale kept them watered by carrying pails from a hole chopped in creek ice, then warming her fingers at their flanks before making the next trip. Pike sent a clerk to 3 homes asking for firewood in exchange for promissory notes. 2 declined. 1 gave him half a crate. On January 25th, with nighttime readings near 48 below and winds still above 40 miles per hour, Nessa took command where older men hesitated. She came to the church at dawn with lashes iced white, cheeks wax pale, and told those inside that Bo's lines remained standing from the rise to the school and to the livery, and that the warm floor house had room if movement began immediately in groups tied 6 to a rope. Pike was there, shoulders drawn inward under a borrowed coat, and heard her without comment. Nels Harrow asked whether the route to Bo had drifted over the lower knots. Nessa answered that she had just walked it and retied 2 markers by touch. Then she turned to Pike and said, "If we wait for weather to grant permission, we will bury more than roofs." They set out in a staggered file, 14 souls on the first pass, each with 1 hand on rope and 1 on the shoulder ahead. Nessa led. Nels anchored the rear. Pike walked in the middle carrying a canvas bundle of ledgers wrapped in oilcloth, then dropped it when a gust shoved the line sideways and reached instead for the arm of a coughing boy beside him. The crossing took 14 minutes for a distance that in fair weather required 3. Twice the file went to knees. Once they stopped entirely while Bo, clipped to the opposite line, advanced from his staging pocket and shouted corrections through a scarf stiff with frost. "Hold left at the second post. Do not release the rope. 1 step at a time." They reached his door as a unit, stumbling, faces white with rime, and entered in order exactly as his slate instructed. Bo did not ask who had mocked him. He did not ask what anyone could pay. He moved souls from entry to grates, assigned dry places by age and condition, set Nessa to mitten rails, and sent Pike and 2 ranch hands to haul snow from melt barrels once their fingers had regained strength. He fed the exterior box in timed intervals, opened the subfloor grates by sequence, and kept the damper where heat would travel long under plank before rising. Warmth spread, steady and low, through boots and bone. Outside, the storm kept striking the town like a hammer against thin tin. Inside, the floor held. Inside, the floor held. And because it held, order became possible where panic had ruled an hour earlier. Bo set the first rule at once. No one stayed in wet wool. He pointed Pike and the ranch hands toward the peg rails, directed Nessa to strip ice-stiff mittens from children and press dry cloth into their hands, and sent Nels Harrow to the rear hatch for broth jars marked with black charcoal bands. The underfloor channels gave heat low and even, not the sharp blast of an overfed stove, and that steadiness mattered more than brilliance. Souls who had arrived shaking too hard to speak began to breathe in longer pulls. Frost on beards turned to droplets. Boots stopped ringing against plank. By midday, a second line came from the schoolroom, then a third from the livery. Each group tied 6 to a rope as Nessa had ordered. Bo kept a slate at the entry and marked arrivals in careful strokes by household age and condition, because confusion killed as surely as cold when rooms grew crowded. At 72 souls, the main room was full. At 83, the threshold became a rotation point, and Bo put the system into the form he had designed in private months before anyone believed he would need it. The least stable were placed nearest the center grates for 90 minutes at a time. Workers who could still walk took the outer benches, warmed, drank, then returned along the lines to bring the next group through. No one argued with the sequence once they felt what the floor could do. The storm did not yield. Through 26th January, winds stayed above 40 miles per hour, and drifts climbed against the lee wall until half the windows disappeared in white. Bo fed the exterior firebox on a fixed rhythm. Split pine first for quick rise, coal second for depth, damper to third notch for 12 minutes, then back to first so heat traveled the full run under plank instead of racing up the stack. He did not keep the method to himself. Each charge became a lesson, spoken in short phrases to whoever stood nearest with steady hands. Nessa learned it by repetition. Nels learned the clean-out order by feel in the dark. Pike learned to read draft by watching the chimney pulse against lantern light, his own fingers blackened with soot by the end of the first night. Wealth and standing had no purchase here. Sequence did. Food moved by ratio, not sentiment. Broth first, then coarse meal porridge, then beans if a soul had strength to digest them. Bo opened the root vault in measured intervals to preserve temperature, counting jars out and empties back. Pike, who had sold his last beans at 6-fold price, now stood at the cedar shelves and passed jars hand to hand, without comment, while Bo called quantities by row and mark. 40 sacks of grain that had once looked excessive now became arithmetic for survival. 1 pound per soul per day when labor remained moderate, less when bodies were still and weak. Lamp oil was cut to half wicks after midnight. Meltwater was strained through wool and boiled in shifts. The expensive failures of autumn lay plain beyond the walls. Split stovepipes, collapsed roofs, emptied shelves, promissory notes that could not burn hot enough to warm a room. On the evening of January the 27th, the wind finally dropped from a roar to a hard, unsteady hiss. No one mistook that sound for safety, yet men were able to step outside without being thrown sideways, and the rope lines could be walked with lanterns at arm length rather than by touch alone. Bo led the first full circuit at dawn on the 28th, with Nessa at his shoulder and Nels on the rear line. They found doors pinned shut by drifts higher than lintels, 2 barns folded, 3 chimneys snapped, and smoke absent from too many roofs. They dug where they could, marked where they could not, and returned each name to the slate by the door, so no household would vanish into rumor. Coldwater had survived, but not whole. 3 days passed before the count settled, and the dead could be buried in ground still iron-hard beneath the top thaw. Elias Finch was laid beside his wife with the twine bundle placed on the coffin lid until the final prayer. Marta Keene's unfinished mittens were folded into her shawl by her husband's own hands. Reverend Abel Crow was buried nearest the church path he had tried to keep open, with Nels Harrow and Pike sharing the same rope on the descent to the grave because the slope remained slick with refrozen drift. Bo stood at each burial and spoke at none of them. His work was not finished. By the 2nd week of February, he had turned the warm floor house into a workshop, as much as a shelter. Every afternoon, while the cold still held near zero, he ran practical instruction for crews of 4 to 6, how to cut a crawl space without undermining load points, how to set flue fall by string line and water level, how to vent an exterior feed so smoke never entered sleeping rooms, how to bank walls with packed earth in 6-inch lifts that would not slump by spring. He used his own house as diagram and warning both, opening clean-out ports, showing soot accumulation, naming each mistake he had corrected in October before the storms. Nessa kept a chalkboard of measurements. Nels handled tool discipline. Pike brought materials from what remained of his inventory at cost and wrote each transaction on a public sheet pinned to the church door. When thaw reached the upper ruts in early March, the town called a meeting in the church, not to celebrate but to decide whether Coldwater would rebuild by old habits or by the method that had kept 83 souls alive. The benches were full, coats still worn indoors, hats in laps. Pike stood first. He had lost weight through the winter and his prosperous ease had gone out of him, replaced by the stiff bearing of a man who had slept badly for weeks and intended to say what he could no longer carry. "I named his house Tucker's Tomb," he said, voice even but dry. "I repeated that name until children used it. I raised prices when fear rose. I denied him credit, then sold dear to others. I called his work panic and his judgment unsound, and when signs of danger stood before us, I preferred my ledger to his evidence. My store roof fell. His floor held. I cannot return Elias Finch to his woodpile, nor Marta Keene to her children, nor Reverend Crow to this pulpit. I can state only this. I was wrong in public, and the cost of my pride was paid by more than myself." No one clapped. There was no sound except stove draft and the scrape of one bench as a widow shifted her weight. Then others rose, not in a line and not by plan, but because silence had become heavier than speech. A rancher admitted he had ridden the berms flat at night. A school trustee admitted he had repeated Pike's claim about poisoned air without ever seeing the vents. 2 women from Willow Lane said they had crossed the street to avoid Bo in town and had sent their sons to mock him by name. Nels Harrow spoke last among them and said he had known better sooner than most, yet had failed to force the issue when a harder warning might have saved time. Shame moved through the room without spectacle, plain and unsheltered. When Bo finally stood, he did not move to the pulpit. He remained beside the center aisle, hat in both hands, and looked first toward the rear benches where the Keene children sat with their aunt, then toward the place Reverend Crow had occupied each Sunday. "The dead require more than apology," he said. "Words may clear a conscience, but they do not seal a flue or dry a woodpile. I did not build that house to be proven right, and I will not pretend that this winter did not wound me as your winter wounded you. If you seek forgiveness today, I do not have a simple one to give. If you seek repair, that can begin before sundown. I will teach any soul willing to learn. with no fee except discipline. You will post your costs where all can read them. You will train your children in the same order you train yourselves. You will keep rope, fuel, grain, and water by measure, not by hope. Call that forgiveness if you wish. I call it duty to the living. The decision was taken by a standing vote, every soul on the benches rising except one old man, too frail to stand, who raised his hand instead. Through spring and summer of 1888, Coldwater became a town of measured labor. Crews rotated by street and household. Pike's remaining lumber moved first to widows and to families with infants. Stone was quarried from the creek cut and hauled at shared team rates. Public ledgers were posted each week on the church door exactly as Bow required. Lime, 28 cents per sack. Flue tile, 9 to 12 cents per foot depending on quality. Cedar posts, $1 each if cut local. Labor exchanged by hour, recorded against winter ration credits. By first frost, 23 homes had adapted underfloor channels or bank thermal walls, and both schoolroom and church had exterior-fed fireboxes with safe vent runs. Years passed, and the phrase that had begun as ridicule altered in meaning. New settlers asking where to build heard older hands say, "Build like Tucker," and what they meant was not style but preparedness. Drain first, vent true, store deep, share early. Nessa Vale grew into the town's most trusted winter foreman, carrying Bow's measurement book in a leather wrap and teaching children to tie blind knots before they learned penmanship. Pike rebuilt his store smaller, with stone piers and a banked north wall, and kept one shelf each autumn marked reserve stock for storm use at fixed price, the numbers posted where every customer could read them. In 1908, 20 years after the killing winter, carpenters lifted sections of Bow's original floor to replace worn joists, and Coldwater saw fully what had sat beneath their feet since the beginning. The visible twin flues were only the upper runs. Below them lay a broader heat labyrinth of cross channels, cut through packed earth, and stone baffles, built to spread warmth farther on less fuel than anyone had guessed. At the rear, fed by roof runoff and hand pump, sat a cistern-linked humidity chamber that kept root stores from desiccating through long, cold spells. On a stone lintel near the lowest cleanout, protected all those years from soot and boot scuff, they found words Bow had cut with a mason's chisel and then sealed from sight. Build for the worst day, then feed whoever arrives. Coldwater still stands, and in winter the oldest houses keep an even warmth that begins at the feet. The lesson endured because one outcast refused revenge, chose instruction, and made survival a shared craft rather than a private advantage. The lesson endured first in mud season, not in speech. On April 18, 1888, with thaw water running brown along every wagon rut in Coldwater, Bow set a string line across the McGreedy yard and made 6 men pull it taut until it sang. He knelt, pressed 2 fingers into the softened ground, and told them to cut no trench until the drainage fall was proven twice, once by line and once by water in a tin cup. Pike stood 3 paces behind the crew in a work coat that still fit like store cloth rather than field wear, boots sunk to the welt in mud, riding costs as Bow called them, flue tile lengths, 22 feet for this house, at 10 cents per foot from salvage, lime, 3 sacks, 28 cents each. Cedar for clean-out frames, $1.04. Labor exchanged, not sold, 6 hours from each household that had taken shelter in January. The old arithmetic of winter, where some paid dearly and others could not pay at all, was replaced by a ledger nailed to the church door every Saturday before dusk. Bow checked the posting each week, corrected a figure once, and never signed his name at the bottom. By May 2nd, the rope lines that had carried souls through whiteout were taken down in an orderly sequence and dried in the church nave, each length stretched between pew ends so mildew would not claim it. Nessa supervised that work with the same clipped authority she had used in the storm. reading Bo's knot marks like letters, setting aside frayed sections for short utility runs, coiling sound hemp by root and distance. The lantern caches were opened, counted and repacked with fresh waxed matches, then sealed in tin pails and stored under the schoolroom stage for the next hard season. No item was left to chance. The grapnel from Nels Harrow's forge was rehung by the church door, where anyone could reach it. Pike brought forward a stack of promissory notes written during the worst week of the blizzard, names from 3 streets and 2 ranch lanes. He placed them on the school stove lid one evening after class, looked to Bo for permission, and fed every note to the fire. No one applauded. The paper curled, blackened, and was gone. On May 19th, Pike came to the rise after sundown, carrying Bo's old account card from Pike General Supply, the one denied in October for pork, wheat, oil, and salt. He held it in both hands as if it were brittle glass. Bo was at the exterior fire alcove replacing a warped grate bar, and did not turn until Pike spoke. "I kept this because I meant to prove myself prudent," Pike said. "I looked at it all winter. 40 pounds of pork, 60 pounds of wheat, 8 gallons of lamp oil, 5 sacks of salt. It was not extravagance. It was a map of what was coming, and I refused it because the request came from you." Bo took the card, read the figures once in silence, and set it on the stone ledge beside the tools. "You refuse because pride is cheaper at first," he answered. "It is dear by January." Pike nodded, then stood waiting as if a verdict might still be issued. "What do you require of me now?" he asked. Bo lifted the new bar into place, checked its seat, and said, "I require accuracy. Keep fixed storm prices posted where children can read them. Keep reserve shelves sealed until council vote opens them. If you cannot do that, sell the store to someone who can." Pike swallowed, shoulders tight in the lantern light. "I will do it." "Then do it for 20 winners," Bo said. "One season proves nothing." The most difficult reckonings came without witnesses. Marta Keene's husband, Owen, did not speak at the March meeting beyond his name, and many assumed he had nothing to say. On June 7th, he arrived at Bo's door with Marta's work basket, thumb gusset mittens still unfinished, and asked for instruction on vent sealing, because he intended to winter in the same cabin with 3 children and no margin left for error. Bo cleared a place at the table, set the basket between them, and taught him from first principles until moonrise: warm air leakage paths, frost bridge points, ash disposal, ember discipline. Owen listened without once asking pardon and without once being offered consolation by word. When he left, he took his basket and a cut list for an exterior feed box in his pocket. By first frost, his chimney drew clean. Not every soul crossed that distance. 2 ranch hands who had stamped Bo's berms flat never apologized and never attended instruction. And in the winter of 1889, one of them lost half his hay to a poorly banked shed wall that failed under drift. They rebuilt the next spring using Bo's posted measurements anyway, taking them from Nessa when Bo was out on a quarry run. Coldwater saw that and understood the shape of shame when speech failed. In September's 1888, 1 year after the first stones were laid on the rise, Reverend Crow's successor led a memorial service at 3 graves marked by matching cedar posts. Elias Finch's twine bundle was hung in a glass-fronted box at the church vestibule. Marta Keene's unfinished mitten pair lay beside it, mended by Nessa but never worn. Abel Crow's rope, dried and cleaned, was coiled under the pulpit with a brass tag naming the creek crossing where he fell. After the prayers, Bo spoke only once, from the rear aisle. "Remember details, not legends. Details keep the living." The congregation answered in silence and filed out to inspect the first completed thermal floor at the schoolhouse annex. On August 12, 1908, when carpenters lifted the worn planks in Beau's original main room and found the deeper cross channels and the cistern-fed humidity chamber, half the town climbed the rise by noon to see whether rumor had exaggerated the discovery. It had not. Beneath the visible twin runs lay a second network cut with surveyor precision, each channel sloped and baffled to hold heat longer on less fuel than any of Beau's students had managed to replicate. The cistern valve, hidden behind a stone plate, fed controlled moisture through narrow clay throats into the root vault airstream. Nessa Vale, now 35 and called Foreman Vale by every crew in town, crouched beside the lowest lintel while a carpenter held a lamp and read the carved line aloud exactly once before stepping back so others could hear it in their own voices. Build for the worst day, then feed whoever arrives. Pike, older and stooped, touched the edge of that lintel with soot-marked fingers and gave a small, unsteady breath. He had kept his storm shelf for 20 years. The prices remained fixed each October by public vote and painted on pine board at his counter. He had not missed a posting. Beau did not permit the chamber to become a relic. He ordered the planks reset after measurements were copied, demanded that 3 apprentices diagram the full system from memory before seeing their notes, and made the town council fund a second training hall near the school so no household would need to crowd his own floor during instruction. The original ledger from 1887, edges soft with handling, passed from his keeping to Nessa's that autumn in a plain cedar box. She signed for it before witnesses and added her own pages: geese flight dates, beaver dam heights, moon halo records, first freeze depth by street, and the hour telegraph service resumed after the line east of Granite Falls was rebuilt. Every strange sign once mocked was entered as data, dated, compared, and taught to children at the winter term's opening week. Coldwater stands in the present tense with 487 souls and winter drills each October. The old rope routes are marked by iron eyes still set in stone where Beau placed cedar posts 30 yards apart, and schoolchildren run them in mittens while Foreman Vale's successors call cadence in clear weather, so panic never writes the first instruction. The church and school keep exterior-fed fireboxes with clean-out plates numbered in order. Pike General Supply, now managed by his daughter and then her son, opens reserve shelves only after council tally, with costs posted before the latch is lifted. At the Rise, Beau Tucker's half-sunken house remains occupied each cold season as a teaching place, its floor warm from measured fire, its lintel inscription recited to every new family before the first snow. The town endures because preparedness became common practice, and common practice became moral law.